Good evening. At the beginning of this course, I showed you a graph of the growth in the human population since the beginning of its origins until and up to projecting into 2050. And we said that that tremendous growth that we're currently experiencing and the ultimate population we may reach is going to place an incredible burden on the resources of this planet to support all of those people. And as we've noted with a number of other critical resources, when faced with such a situation, you basically have two choices. You can either produce more resources, or you can endeavor to use less of the ones that you have. Up to now, most of the chapters we've looked at have focused on producing new resources, and we've looked at that in terms of ecosystems and how ecosystems produce resources and how they recycle resources for use by both humans and other living things on the planet. Beginning with chapters 8 and 9, we're going to start looking at the consumption end of the issue, at least with regard to the human population. Here's the graph that we began the course with, showing the growth in human population from the beginning of its origins up through approximately 2200. Several things to comment about this graph now that we've gone through a few chapters in the book. First of all, the human population, as we noted, did not grow very much up through the late 1800s. This was primarily because of the fact that humans weren't being born in too much greater amount than they were actually dying off due to things such as disease and war. And in fact, during this time, man went through a number of different kinds of what we call revolutions that helped him to prepare for a time when he would ultimately have some control over his environment. In the book, you will read about the Neolithic Revolution, when man began taming animals and growing his own crops, and then the Industrial Revolution, where he learned how to be able to do things in a more efficient manner with less effort and less danger. And then finally, we're going to see that it was in the late 1800s when man finally was able to overcome his greatest predator, which was in fact bacteria. And by overcoming disease, he was able to significantly impact his ability to survive. And at that point, the human growth curve took off in what we would called in one of our other chapters a typical J-curve type fashion, reminiscent of our approaches to survival, which is having many offspring, except that we know that humans aren't the type of animal that has a lot of offspring for the purposes of survival. Rather, humans are more like the K-type reproducers who have few individual children but make sure that they survive into adulthood. And consequently, we don't stay on a J-curve type trajectory, but it begins to curve off at the top and level off at what would be the human carrying population, which in this curve is estimated at being about 10 billion. The question, of course, is how do we know that the population of the world will level off around 10 billion? How do we even know that it will level off? Why wouldn't it continue up in a J trajectory like we saw with other species which were headed towards extinction? Well, as it turns out, there's one obvious answer, and that is that mankind has the ability to shape his environment and through technology perhaps gain ways of producing more resources to sustain his ability to produce enough resources for people to live on. The other answer, though, turns out to be rather surprising, and that is that in all the human populations in developed countries, as it turns out, as a country becomes more developed, i.e. it becomes more affluent, it tends to naturally level off in its population. So the short and surprising answer to whether or not mankind will eventually be able to control his population lies in the simple concept that if we can make mankind more affluent around the entire globe, if we can improve the standard of living for all peoples on Earth, mankind will naturally slow his reproductive growth and level off at what would be a natural carrying capacity for the human population. But knowing a thing and being able to accomplish it are obviously two different things. This particular map shows the distribution of high-income countries versus low-income countries. The countries in green, it will not surprise you to know, are the ones that are the most affluent countries in the world. The ones in the dark brown are the poorest, and the ones in the gray are sort of in between, that are on their way to hopefully becoming more affluent. But to give you an idea of the differences in the wealth between the haves and the have-nots, the affluent countries make up only about 15% of the world's population, yet they control 80% of the world's wealth, whereas the poorest countries represent about 39% of the world's population, but only contain 3% of the world's wealth. Trying to bring the entire world up to an affluent or even reasonable by today's standards level of affluence is going to be a very difficult and challenging prospect, but it's a necessary one, particularly if we're going to address such issues as controlling the birth rate of the world. To give you an idea, most of the affluent green countries here have reduced their population birth rates down to less than 2 children per couple. That means that there are actually fewer children being born to replace the parents that produce them. They have what would in fact be a negative population growth, as compared to the poor countries, which have more than 5 children per couple being born in a woman's lifetime, which is obviously more than doubling the population growth of those countries. And in fact, the majority of all population growth in the world between now and the foreseeable future is going to be happening in the poor developing countries. So to the extent that we can improve the lot of the poor countries in the world, we can improve the lot of the entire world by helping to curtail the human population growth rate. However, attempts to improve global affluence are not without their own environmental consequences, because most of the developing poor countries are those which do not have the capacity or infrastructure to manufacture goods. They must turn to utilizing their own natural resources as a source of quick wealth. And many times the harvesting of those natural resources is not done in an environmentally sustainable fashion. The picture that's accompanying my narration here shows what has happened when countries attempt to clear wide swaths of land for the purpose of growing food and agriculture. Many times they're more concerned with trying to make arable land available for farming than they are the consequences of burning down huge tracts of trees that serve as ecosystems and homes for many different species of animals that are necessary for maintaining the cycling of nutrients. And so in many developing countries, natural resources are harvested in a very non-environmental or sustainable fashion, which leads to its own problem. Also in this chapter, we're going to look at some of the demographics of that population growth in both developed and developing countries, and how they differ in terms of projections of what kinds of issues the two different types of countries are going to have to deal with. What we see in this accompanying graph is the current, as of 2005, demographics of population in the United States that shows that the majority or the largest proportion of people alive in the United States are in an age group of between 30 and 50. This was largely due to the fact that of the baby boomers being produced after World War II. After the baby boomers, there was sort of and as a result of the development of birth control in the 60s, there was a noticeable drop-off in the number of children that were being born, which means that following the baby boom, there was a baby bust, if you will, as the baby boomers put off having children. It's projected, though, in another 20 years that, again, the baby boom population is going to move up into the upper areas of age, obviously, and with them will go a lot of other issues, such as who's going to be providing the resources necessary to sustain an aging population that makes up the largest percentage of the population of the United States. And how are we going to care, especially for the ever increasing very old that will be produced, as there are going to be far more people approaching retirement age than there are people working in order to support the people of retirement age. This graph serves to show the causes of the sort of perfect storm we have right now with regard to human growth population explosion. If we look at the phase one of what is called the demographic transition, we have a primitive era in which the amount of birth that is occurring is balanced almost to the same degree with the amount of death that's occurring. And it's the difference between birth and death that determines what the actual population is. And because there wasn't a whole lot of difference between those two rates, the populations were relatively, population increases were relatively small. At the final end of the demographic transition in phase four, you have both a low death rate, but also a low birth rate. This is the modern era. And again, the difference between the birth rate and the death rate is relatively small, and therefore the population is relatively small. Where the problem comes is that transition between the rate of birth rate lowering and the rate of the death rate lowering, because the death rates typically decline much sooner than the birth rates do. And because the population growth is a function of the difference between the death rate and the birth rate, it's during this transition, phase two and phase three, that you have these huge population increases. And this is where the majority of developing countries, the poor countries, and to a lesser extent the middle income countries, are currently right now. The huge, almost exclusive increase in population growth in the world right now is a result of this demographic transition in developing and about to develop countries.